By the beginning of the 20th century of the Common Era, British colonisation in Australia had achieved its primary objective. Control over land was secured, indigenous resistance had been contained or displaced, and colonial systems of law and governance were fully embedded. What followed was not an end to colonisation, but the unfolding of its long-term consequences. Federation in 1901 of the Common Era marked a symbolic turning point. The Commonwealth of Australia was formed as a self-governing nation within the British Empire. Yet this new political identity was built upon foundations laid during the colonial period. Aboriginal peoples were excluded from the national project. They were not counted in the census. They were not recognised as citizens. The new nation inherited colonial structures without revisiting their moral or legal basis. Dispossession was now normalised. By the early 20th century of the Common Era, Aboriginal people across Australia lived under a patchwork of state-based control regimes. Protection boards, missions, and reserves regulated movement, employment, marriage, and residence. These systems differed in detail but shared a common purpose: to manage Aboriginal existence rather than recognise Aboriginal sovereignty. Economic marginalisation deepened. Access to land, the foundation of independence, had been almost entirely severed. Aboriginal labour was exploited in agriculture, domestic service, and pastoral industries, often without fair wages or legal protection. In many regions, wages were withheld under government control schemes, creating enforced dependency and poverty that persisted across generations. Cultural suppression intensified. Languages were discouraged or banned in institutional settings. Ceremonies were restricted. Knowledge transmission was interrupted. Colonial authorities promoted assimilation as policy, arguing that Aboriginal identity would eventually disappear. This belief shaped governance throughout the first half of the 20th century of the Common Era. Children bore the heaviest burden. From the early 1900s onward, governments increasingly removed Aboriginal children from their families. Officials claimed this was done for protection or education. In reality, it functioned as a tool of social engineering. Family structures were fractured. Cultural continuity was undermined. Trauma was institutionalized. Resistance did not end. Aboriginal people adapted. Communities preserved language, law, and identity where possible. Individuals challenged restrictions through quiet defiance, mobility, and survival. Political awareness grew slowly, often under extreme constraint. Colonisation had reshaped the terrain of resistance, but it had not eliminated it. The consequences of colonisation were not abstract. They were lived daily in restricted movement, controlled labour, enforced separation, and social exclusion. By the mid-20th century of the Common Era, inequality between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians was entrenched across health, education, income, and life expectancy. These disparities were not accidental outcomes of modernisation. They were direct results of colonial policy. This period reveals a crucial truth. Colonisation does not conclude when administration replaces violence. Its effects compound over time. Systems built to dispossess continue to shape lives long after their original purpose is obscured. By the mid-20th century of the Common Era, the consequences of British colonisation had become impossible to ignore. Despite decades of control, assimilation policies had failed to erase Aboriginal identity. Instead, they produced resistance of a new kind: political, legal, and organised. The period following the Second World War marked a turning point. Internationally, colonial empires were being challenged. Ideas of human rights, self-determination, and equality gained global prominence. Australia, increasingly visible on the world stage, came under scrutiny for its treatment of Aboriginal peoples. Colonial practices that had once been justified as internal matters were now exposed to external judgment. Domestically, Aboriginal activism grew. In 1938 of the Common Era, the Day of Mourning protest in Sydney marked one of the first coordinated national political actions by Aboriginal leaders. It challenged the celebratory narrative of colonisation and reframed 1988 as a date of invasion rather than settlement. This moment laid groundwork that would resonate for decades. After 1945 of the Common Era, Aboriginal organisations expanded in number and influence. Leaders demanded citizenship rights, legal equality, and recognition of land loss. These demands were not requests for inclusion alone. They were challenges to the legitimacy of the colonial state itself. Legal barriers began to crack. In 1962 of the Common Era, the Commonwealth granted Aboriginal people the right to vote in federal elections. 5 years later, in 1967 of the Common Era, a national referendum resulted in an overwhelming vote to amend the Constitution. Aboriginal people would now be counted in the census, and the federal government gained power to legislate on their behalf. These changes were symbolic but significant. They did not restore land. They did not dismantle protection regimes overnight. Yet they marked a public acknowledgement that Aboriginal people existed within the nation, rather than outside it. The silence enforced during the colonial period began to fracture. Land rights emerged as the central issue. In the late 1960s and early 1970s of the Common Era, Aboriginal activists shifted focus toward reclaiming country. The Gurindji strike at Wave Hill, beginning in 1966 of the Common Era, evolved from a labor dispute into a landmark land rights movement. It exposed the economic foundations of dispossession and forced public debate. The colonial narrative was no longer uncontested. Historians, activists, and communities challenged myths of peaceful settlement. Frontier violence, once marginalized or denied, entered public discourse. Museums, universities, and courts became battlegrounds over memory and meaning. Colonization was increasingly understood not as a closed chapter, but as a continuing structure. These developments reshaped national consciousness. Australia could no longer present itself solely as a success story of progress and development. The costs of that progress, measured in land, lives, and cultures, were increasingly acknowledged, if not yet fully addressed. If you find value in careful, evidence-based history that confronts uncomfortable truths rather than avoiding them, consider subscribing. It helps keep serious historical storytelling visible in a space that often prefers simplicity over accuracy. By the late 20th century of the Common Era, Australia faced a historical reckoning that could no longer be postponed. The structures created during British colonisation remained deeply embedded, yet the moral authority that once justified them had eroded. The nation entered a period defined by recognition, contestation, and unresolved responsibility. Legal challenges brought colonial assumptions into question. In 1992 of the Common Era, the High Court decision in Mabo v Queensland overturned the doctrine of terra nullius. For the first time, Australian law acknowledged that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples possessed systems of law and land ownership prior to British invasion. Native title was recognised, not as a gift from the state, but as a surviving right. This ruling marked a rupture in legal history. It exposed the foundational fiction upon which colonisation had relied. Yet recognition was limited. Native title claims faced strict evidentiary requirements, and many were extinguished by prior grants. The law acknowledged survival while preserving much of the colonial land system intact. Public acknowledgement followed unevenly. In 1997 of the Common Era, the Bringing Them Home report documented the forced removal of Aboriginal children. It described the policies and consequences of what became known as the stolen generations. The report challenged Australians to confront the human cost of assimilation and control. In 2008 of the Common Era, the Prime Minister issued a formal apology to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The apology recognised suffering and injustice, but it did not alter land ownership, economic inequality, or structural disadvantage. Symbolism outpaced transformation. The legacy of colonisation remained measurable. Across health, education, income, and life expectancy, disparities persisted. Incarceration rates among Aboriginal Australians reflected ongoing institutional bias. Remote communities faced inadequate infrastructure. Cultural revival occurred alongside continued marginalisation. These outcomes were not remnants of a distant past. They were the cumulative effects of policy decisions spanning centuries. At the same time, Aboriginal resilience endured. Languages were revitalized. Cultural practices re-emerged. Legal advocacy expanded. Young leaders reframed debates around sovereignty, treaty, and self-determination. The colonial expectation of disappearance had failed. Survival itself became a form of resistance. The historical narrative shifted again. Historians increasingly described colonization as a structure rather than an event, an ongoing process rather than a completed chapter. This perspective reframed responsibility. If colonization was continuous, then its consequences demanded continuous response. Australia now stands between acknowledgement and action. Recognition without restitution remains incomplete. Memory without repair risks becoming performance. The challenge confronting the nation is not whether colonization occurred, but what responsibility follows from that fact. British colonization of Australia reshaped land, law, and life across an entire continent. It created a nation while dispossessing others. Its success depended on violence, bureaucracy, and denial. Its legacy endures in institutions that continue to shape everyday experience. This is why the history cannot be concluded with a date. Colonization did not simply happen to Australia. It built Australia.